Sorry. All right. Hi, Elma.
Hello.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third series of the Just in Discussion series. It is the third in the series, and today we will be talking about an interesting topic that is not exactly topical, but something that's more global and economic in aspect, which is system evolution, alternatives to the capitalistic economic model. And the core crux of our question will be, is there an alternative to the economic system as it stands today? And is that idea even feasible in the 21st century? So with us today, we have Elma Berisha, who is also a executive member of our Just Committee. Elma, would you like to give a brief introduction about yourself?
Hi, Hassanal. Thank you for giving me time. This is a very good opportunity to talk about these very important issues, especially now on the face of pandemics that is affecting everybody. So, well, I am one of the members of Just Executive Committee. So I live and work here in Malaysia for a very long time. By the way, I came to this kind of topics and this kind of concerns when it comes to capitalist system and economic models and all that. I came by way of behavioral economics, which is an intersection between psychology and economics, as well as by way of organizational psychology, which is industrial organizational psychology and social psychology that deals with issues which are very interrelated with economics. And as has been recognized in the past few years by many Nobel Prize winners, that these are issues which are very much interrelated.
Right. In that case, I think we can begin starting off the question actually with recognizing first that currently the system of economics that's very dominant currently in the 21st century in terms of global economics has been essentially a very capitalist sort of style of economics with profit-based motives, things to do with getting profits more often than not than anything else. So I suppose since you actually deal with more on the psychology, the issues of those things, maybe what do you think? How has contemporary capitalism contributed in addressing issues of prime concerns to do with social injustices, such as poverty, education, health, and welfare? Because these are concerns that seemingly a lot of people have attributed to not being addressed. In fact, they say that capitalism economics to them has been something that has caused a lot more grievances than it has actually, especially if you talk about the pandemic. We can get onto that topic later because the issue of the pharmaceutical companies and all that will come out. But can you give an insight on how do you see capitalism contributing to issues of social justice?
Yeah, I think capitalism is present in almost every country today in one form or another. So it's an undeniable reality. So how it has contributed to improvement or exacerbation of our social issues. Actually, this is a very important question because many people are sort of dealing with it nowadays and have been dealing with it for many years now. Even at the peak of capitalistic prosperity, people have been discussing these issues, right? Because they are very essential for the welfare of the human being as a whole. So as I said, you have capitalism everywhere today. And many people now are talking about the Great Reset, in a way, the reset of capitalism, talking about alternative models of economics, talking about participatory economics, sharing economy and all that. So alternatives do exist, and actually they are in limited kind of scale of operation as we speak now. The problem is that it is being in a very limited kind of practicality, and it's not being accessible or it's not being allowed to be accessible to all of us. So majorly, because I always want to see things, and I have sort of discerned this kind of great difference or great chasm between the many and the few. So in a way, in many ways, I believe that today we live in sort of parallel universes. There is a universe for the rich, a universe for the few, and there is the universe for the rest of us, which is the many of us. So if you see things like this, then you can see that alternatives exist. There is nothing unfeasible about alternative models to addressing and managing our economic issues as we progress in this postmodern age, age of information, age of big data. The thing is that the access for all of us to those alternatives is being blocked in many ways. And, that is a great point, and that goes back to what the economics is, in fact, or how economics is being defined within this capitalistic kind of mindset. And I was personally very shocked to find out that economics is defined as the science of scarce resources. I thought that scarcity is something which is um, some sort of aberration. It happens here and there in certain locations, certain periods of time. We have scarcity of certain products, scarcity of certain resources. I mean, there is no denial about it. But making that kind of aberration or making that kind of exception a rule or a norm for the rest of the economic activity to base on it or to define or to rely on that kind of fundamental assumption, I think it's been very shocking for me to discover. And this is where I came in from the psychological perspective, because in all psychology, what we do is we teach people how to change their mindset, how to think in terms of abundancy, how to think in terms of sharing, in terms of positivity, rather than think in the negative kind of twist, which will always end up in a kind of disastrous way. So, yeah. So this is something that I think it has to change, defining economic activity in terms of scarce resources. Well, scarce resources for whom? So it's in a way, again, going back to the few versus the many. So the few have the scarce resources because they have the unlimited needs and wants, and they are allowed to do so. But the many have the scarce resources because we are not allowed to have even the basic needs being met. And you can see this, it's, you see, when I speak about this, it might sound a little bit strange, but this is actually what is happening. In 2019, you had we had the news about the science of poverty Nobel Prize winning scientists doing this RCT, randomized controlled trials with the poverty projects, which are very expensive anyway. So you had this news and everybody was like, wow, this is great. You know, we finally have started to think about these important issues, you know, trying to make a change. And my first question was, do we need science to fix poverty? Do we really need science to fix poverty? It gives you the illusion that the economic model is fine. It sort of legitimizes the status quo. The model is perfect. It's just that we have this issue of poverty that it is unavoidable given the scarcity resources, and we need time to fix it, to work scientifically, to find, to have these scientific breakthroughs to fix the economic issues. So it is completely misleading, and this is why I am so obsessed with the scarcity problem, because it works differently for the few and it works differently for the many. Basically, today, and it has become much more meeting the awareness of general public, the economy of 1%, which is the richest 1% of the world owning the biggest part of the wealth compared to the rest of the world, right? Maybe before a few decades, people were not aware of this. Maybe before a few decades, the proportions were not as disastrous as they are today. But the Occupy Wall Street movement has brought this to the public attention. And today everybody is aware of this. That's why everybody is talking about alternative ways of managing our economic affairs.
That's true. There's a lot to unpack on that one, especially when it comes to understanding the concept of scarcity. It does inform a lot of how capitalistic economy. The first one I want to note is that, yes, there's actually been, like you said, a very long history of dependence on scientific progressionism to actually determine, to justify certain economic models, especially the capitalist economy models, because they hope that ultimately the scientific progress will catch up and they will address scarcity of resources. You can see this when it comes to energy, you can see this when it comes to food, especially. But then after that, you also brought up the issue of accessibility, especially between the separation of the many and the few.
Yeah.
So ultimately, it becomes like the elites and the powerful manage to play around with the system in order to cordon off accessibility of resources as it maintains its scarcity in order to gain access to it, to secure their access to it. So you could say that in the sense that a lot of what we experience, a lot of conflict that we experience is based on that scarcity, a lot of cordoning off our resources, a lot of discrimination against certain groups of people because of that exploitation. We call it exploitation, but we're just rushing for it essentially.
That's why I say, because you see, we all see and we all observe what's happening. And at one point I thought scarcity is just some sort of underground kind of reality. And to find out that it is the official formal definition of a whole scientific discipline, if I can say economics is a scientific discipline, that is why it is so shocking. And of course, institutions in the West and in the East and everybody have been addressed this issue and talking about the redefinition and all that. Going back to what you mentioned about the access, I can relate this to growth, organic growth, because you see, I used to live in completely different different kind of coordinates of the globe, and I noticed that some of the fruits that we used to have in the backyard and which were wildly growing everywhere, you didn't even have to buy them. You have them everywhere for free. You in Malaysia, you can only purchase those fruits with a very exorbitant kind of price, right? Then I realized this kind of difference and I thought, okay, so here scarcity comes in, the cost of production, distribution, international chains come in. To some degree, it is justifiable. But then this, to some degree, is becoming the norm.
Yep.
Again, today you have a bit of a more inaccessibility to this kind of typical kind of fruits, right? But the way that the system is going, which is very alarming, is that everything is taking this route. Right? So not only a certain type of category of products and goods, but everything is taking these routes to becoming more and more inaccessible for the many compared to the few. And so going back to science progression, science promised that after the mass production kind of achievements, everything will be available for everybody in a cheaper price, which was true to some degree. The point is that the process at one point started working for the few and stopped working for the many. So the promise has been reversed.
If I were to interject a bit, that actually reminds me a lot about what happens to farmers, especially when it comes to genetically modified crops, things like that, because the science is there. The science actually helps crops to become more sustainable, to grow in different types of environment. And this is supposed to help farmers and to alleviate things like hunger, poverty around the globe. And it makes it simpler. But then suddenly you're getting a lot of companies, I'm not going to mention who they are over here, but they are starting to develop these things, and you can only buy certain crops from them, only buy certain patents of crops, bearing certain seeds from them and all these things. And then they realize at some point, it just deviated to the point where they realize they can control how to actually distribute these things, and they've maintained their permanency, their existence, based on the fact that you have no alternative to go anywhere else if you want these type of crops, we're going to give it to you. So that's the thing, because I want to relate that to another question actually, because when it comes to economy models, one of the proposed economy models that I've heard in the past.
If I can interject on
Sure.
the point about the farmers, because it's also very important. And I know that many people do dismiss the local activists, when they recommend you to go for local farmers, help local farmers. It's actually a very big thing to do. And the monopoly, the scientific monopoly, how it works. And this is why I sort of generalize this process. What is happening with a few category of fruits is happening for everything else. Why? Because you have the scientific progression offering you the goods as if they are scientifically producing it. All of the essential goods for human life, which are essential for nutrition of the body and the brain and for the proper functioning of any human being, are actually organically grown for free. And we scientifically investigate what each kind of product produces or contributes in terms of nutrients that we need for our body. But the way that these prices are going are as if they are scientifically producing these goods, right? As if it's their merit, this corporate merit on producing these goods, and they are offering it to you. So it has gone completely reversed for what the scientific progression promised you to be. I don't know what is exactly the time, at the point in time in historical trajectory that this started being so, but I believe it's a very recent kind of reversal of pattern.
Yes, I'm also in that opinion as well, because at the end of the day, when it comes to, because you don't see this in my recollection, I never saw this sort of phenomenon much when I grew up around the 90s, because they all talked about achieving great scientific leaps and technology, things that make humankind better. But then the exploitation of patents, the exploitation of monopolization of copyright, things like that, they realize they can make a lot of money. So I think that's where it starts going AWOL.
The dangerous part is that people are losing trust in science, which is that's very dangerous. Losing trust in science, losing trust in the global institutions, losing trust in local leadership,
On that note, actually, which I think we can relate to another issue, which is what's happening with the coronavirus right now, with the rolling out of the vaccines. A lot of people have the idea, and I think this contributes to why it happened, because people are losing trust in the science. People are losing trust in that, because it's to them to become so corporatized, so capitalized, that they said that the Great Reset, as you mentioned earlier just now, was completely, fabricated, in the sense that a lot of pharmaceutical companies are pushing the coronavirus and all these things, and then they're manufacturing the vaccines in order to get a big payroll, things like that. It starts, whether that's true or not is besides the point. It's more of, it does indicate what you mentioned, the deficit of trust in the sciences, because you start questioning the motives behind big pharmaceuticals, because they start pushing out these things to roll out money, because you see the amount of money exchanged just to roll out the viruses, to actually bring out the viruses. So is it like that? Is it that a great reset is truly happening in order to stamp down and push down on that?
So I don't think, like I said, the alternatives exist, the alternatives are operational, it is very feasible, but it's being controlled, limited for certain bubbles, so it's not being accessible to all of us. I don't think any great reset is actually happening. Actually, many hypothesize that the pandemics is just another justification for this financial crisis we are going through. Because at least now you cannot blame it on liberal capitalism. It is the pandemics. Nobody can blame on anybody. And it's some sort of justification. Many actually were warning of this global crisis, financial crisis coming up, even before the pandemics was on the horizon, right? They knew that our societies are hitting the debt wall, and they knew that it's coming. So how the global pharma now, the lack of trust and all that, to some degree, it is justifiable. Of course, populism, how it has erupted lately in many countries, is not the solution, but it is a direct consequence of this kind of distrust. And going back to modern economy, it's based on distrust. That is the problem. When I say that we need to redefine the promises, why? Because the promises that they are using and they've been operating is taking an exception and making it a norm. So now people can come and say, well, okay, we are all self-interested human beings. We are selfish. We are detrimental to each other. So we need to put some distrust structures in place. In fact, if you observe the human beings, distrust is an aberration. It happens here and there, but the general norm is trust, is cooperation, and it's not competition and distrust. So this is again shifting the whole narrative, is the first step towards making a progress to any kind of alternative model.
That's the only thing as well. I mean, also going back on the issue of distrust, I mean, there are certain adages when it comes to economics, when it comes to capitalism as well, because some cynics will actually obviously say that capitalism is actually the business of creating problems but selling the solution. That's what a lot of them actually do point out when it comes to these things. And it doesn't just relate to what's going on. It relates to things like war and conflict.
As long as the profit is privileged over the people's interest, the people's well-being, as long as the economic growth is the main KPI everybody's chasing, at detriment of ecological, resources, of course, then people will continue to distrust.
Yep. So that's why when it comes to a certain alternative, because I still remember there is one alternative system of economies that's being pushed back in the day, and that has a lot to do based on Buddhism theology and Buddhism philosophy, talking about centrally sustainability. Because at the end of the day, scarcity is the issue, but sustainability needs to be the goal. But then when it comes to sustainability, especially when you're trying to participate in a global economy that is pretty much working against that sort of thing, how will then those kind of economy models survive in that scenario? What do you think?
I think it's a big challenge because it's a very complicated kind of financial ecosystem. You see, you are managing a country, and we know Malaysia managed the what was the crisis, the Asian tigers crisis, managed it a bit differently and much better compared to other countries that they were hit due to certain kind of policies. So if you are operating in such kind of global ecosystem, then actually it's very hard. It's much harder than when we speak like this, because theoretically we can identify the issues and we say this. Let's say I can say for sure, Islamic economy bans usury, right? So we don't want to have it. You go back in history from the very beginning of time, starting, let's say, with Plato, Aristotle, Jewish, all Abrahamic laws, Abrahamic traditions, going back to scholastics, Thomas Aquinas, coming back to all of the great Islamic scholars. Usury was out. It was never an option. Today is part and parcel of every single economic system and every single, I believe in every single Muslim country. I believe so. So if you want to talk about it, it's easier to talk than it's harder to do something about it. But essentially, it is, if everybody in humankind, including the Vedas, the Hindu Vedas, have been contributing to this thought that is a practice which will end up in bad kind of outcome for the majority, then of course there is some wisdom there. There is some wisdom. But when you talk with expert economists, they think, you don't understand the complexity of the system. And there is patterns and relationships between interest rate manipulation, economic growth, long-term, short-term, a lot of other parameters. It becomes like a rocket science, and people are like, oh, okay, so I'm not entitled to talk about it. But in fact, we should talk about it.
Exactly. I mean, they've always, that's the thing that a lot of arguments actually go, is that they try to hide behind the complexity of it. And when you try to unpack the complexity, they say, no, it's impossible to understand. It needs a lot of these things and that thing. It's like, it's always the case.
Yeah, yeah. I've had that a lot. I've had that a lot personally, especially because I'm not trained formally as an economist. But as I said, these are issues everybody's dealing with. These are our social issues. Then everybody has to know about it, and everybody has to participate. Because at the end of the day, like many who are advocating this kind of shift between the current system to a much more welfare-based kind of system, they are putting the human the future of human race at stake. You know, it's something which is a matter of sustainability.
Yeah, ultimately that is the thing actually. Sustainability is the key when it comes to, because everyone wants to prolong the sustainability of their resources, the access to their resources, especially the access. That's the most important thing. But it just seems that so many mechanisms are trying to maintain this vague idea of this status quo of economic power and grip onto their resources. It seems like they're just trying to keep as much for themselves. That's why the whole
even them, whoever is this 1%, they know that it is not sustainable, and they are not going to be in this kind of position for long, because it's simply not sustainable ecologically, materially, financially. It's not going to work. And that's why I believe many, even among them, are thinking and talking about the alternatives, because they are interested to prolong their lifespan.
Yeah. So that's why we see now that when it comes to, at least in my observation, at least when it comes to the economic status quo, the economic power structures that exist right now, because normally it's dominated obviously by Western powers, Western infrastructures, but we're seeing more of a shift right now. People are calling it a decline of capitalism in the West, but I see it as something of a shift of rebalancing of power, where the economic centers of power are now shifting to other places. Think of China, for example. They're trying their best to integrate themselves so strongly into the global logistic trade. And that's why they're actually pushing all these things. They're removing the balance of currency away from the dollars and things like that. So they're trying to shift it over to their side of it. So we're not talking so much about sustainability and future progress, but by eliminating that tight control, I suppose, is there possible ways of avenues to actually talk more about sustainability instead of just maintaining status quo capitalist powers from the Western side? Because some people actually say that is the problem. The West has dominated too long. They've kept it for themselves, but they haven't shared progress. They haven't shared anything of their wealth. What do you think of that?
But you see, people very often fall into the trap of debating on ideological frames, communism versus capitalism, and they lose the sight of so many nuances within capitalism and so many nuances within socialism. There is not only one capitalism. The capitalism before Reagan and Thatcher era is a different kind of capitalism. The capitalism of Cold War era is a different kind of capitalism. Otherwise, it wouldn't have won, right? And I come from a country with a communist history, and I know what communism can do. And when people say, oh, socialism is the model of empty shops, I know that for sure, personally. I recall like vividly the shops in my grandma's village, empty shelves. There was basically nothing, no competition, no production. Because once you have that kind of a common good system whereby there is no, you see, science today, it's such a pity that science achievement today are not being used for in the service of humanity, because it's not that we don't know how humans are motivated or how performance or productivity or social enterprises are being steered and being enhanced. We all know everything exists there, the knowledge exists there. It's that the knowledge is not being used or is being appropriated by the few. Going back to China, I would wish to believe that their version of capitalism is better, but I don't think we have proof so far, and you don't know if it's gonna get worse or if it's gonna, because you see China, by the time that I was not even born, Chinese economy was completely isolated. And in a matter of a few decades, which was like completely speed of light, they opened up the market and they implemented the reforms and they shifted towards capitalistic kind of model. And in a matter of another 10 years after entering the World Trade Organization, they completely changed the policy again. Because the Chinese route was not supposed to go the way that it's going now. I'm not saying well, it's not very good news for the West, but Chinese economy was supposed to be going towards liberalization. No, it was supposed to be reduced state control, right? And it's suddenly, in a matter of 1 decade, the Chinese policies shifted, and they made a U-turn. And it's not a very good news for the monopoly, with the global monopolistic kind of institutions that they've been at the reign of global economy for so long. But if Chinese are interested to come out with a model which would prioritize human well-being, collective well-being, because nowadays when we say human collective well-being, it's not one country well-being anymore. It's the global collective well-being. I mean, the age has, today it's completely different. It's, you cannot, yesterday it was maybe, but today you cannot have prosperity unless there is prosperity for all. So if Chinese are interested to contribute to this, well, that's a good news. But if they are not, and if they are in that kind of competitive, capitalistic kind of craze and frenzy, then it's not good news for anyone.
That's true. So at the end of the day, it's dependent on the paradigm shift that they're actually going to go for, and that paradigm shift that they actually should go for. But ultimately, I think we're actually out of time actually right now. And but I want to actually end on that note and maybe get your final input on that one, because at the end of the day, I feel that unpacking what we've discussed and summarizing what we've discussed, not only is there a need to be a paradigm shift away from this whole scarcity model about building up trust again for the progression of science and for the progression of understanding how our economic system of model needs to actually serve the sustainability and the prosperity of its people. But also, I think just as importantly, we mentioned this just now, that we need to allow also for more discussions on our economy. We do a lot of interfaith discussion. We do a lot of social discussion, but we need to talk more about economic, social discussions as well. At the end of the day, we cannot simply just let it be to the invisible hand, as they call it over there.
Well, there are no, there are invisible hands, but we know who those hands are. So.
Yeah, so okay, I think that at the end of the day, this issue is obviously going to go on for a very long time more, and there'll be more to discuss as well, seeing how things go, especially when we move out from the coronavirus pandemic, hopefully by end of the next year, we'll see it like that. So, but in any case, I want to thank you very much for joining me for this short discussion today.
Pleasure. It was a very interesting conversation. Thank you for having
Thank you for joining us, Elma. And for everyone else as well, thank you for joining us as well. If you want to find out more about what we do at International Movement for a Just World, you can look at the description below. And also for any upcoming events, we'll have a description below, which is our 9th December Christian Zionism webinar. So for more information, just check out the link below, all right? So Elma, thank you very much for joining us. Have a good day. Bye.
Bye.